She was chained for a crime she didn't commit until a Navajo warrior paid in silver and revealed her true bloodline. What came next rewrote history. The wagon rolled slow through the brittle sagebrush plains, its wooden wheels screeching with every jagged turn. The evening sun bled against the sky like an old wound reopened, casting its final glow across the land where justice was often measured in bullets and barbed words. Inside that prison wagon, rattling between iron bars and sorrow, sat a young woman named Coralie Dayton, her wrists bound with rusted shackles, her face streaked with soot and defeat. She had once been the daughter of a modest baker in St. Joseph, Missouri. Her hands used to knead bread and cradle orphan kittens, not drag through desert dust in chains. But that life, those mornings with cinnamon-scented air and warm hearts, had ended the night a fire consumed her family's shop and burned her innocence to ash. They accused her of setting it, claimed the girl had resented the debts and plotted escape with the insurance money that never came. She cried for her father and brother, both lost in the flames, but the town's whispers became roars. No lawyer dared defend a poor girl smeared with smoke and suspicion. When the judge sentenced her to 20 years hard labor at Fort Blackridge's mining camp, no one objected, not a soul. Even the priest bowed his head as if she'd already died. Now, as dusk swallowed the trail, Coralie's heart pulsed with a strange numbness. She didn't think of hope. Hope had become a luxury for people with clean fingernails and last names that meant something. All she had was the rhythm of the wheels, the sting of the iron cuffs, and the burning in her chest that refused to die. No matter how much the world tried to smother it, the driver, a crook-souled bounty man named Turley, spat into the wind and drank deep from a canteen laced with bourbon. Behind him sat two more prisoners, men with murder in their eyes and silence in their mouths. They didn't look at Coralie, nor she at them. The chains that linked their ankles rattled like ghost bells across the wilderness. Above them, the vultures circled, fat with promise. The wagon creaked to a halt near a shallow canyon for the night. Turley and his men built a fire, stringing the prisoners to iron rings hammered into the ground like livestock. Coralie could feel her bones grind from the day's journey, but sleep didn't come. Instead, she stared into the flames, watching the orange tongues lick the dry air, and wondered if her parents' fire had looked the same before it devoured everything. Across the flames, beyond the reach of the light, a shadow moved, a rider. Silent, watching, Turley stood, one hand on his pistol. "You out there better state your business," he barked. But there was no answer, just the wind brushing the grass like an old song. Then came the sound of hooves retreating. Whoever it was, they'd seen enough. Coralie's eyes narrowed. She had felt the weight of that gaze. It hadn't been hostile, but neither was it empty. It had watched her like someone trying to remember a dream long forgotten. Morning came cold and gray. The spy looked bruised as the prisoners were forced back into the wagon. They traveled north now, toward the Badlands, where the mines lay carved into the earth like open sores. Fort Blackridge wasn't a place people left. It swallowed men whole. Women even faster, but fate had grown restless. That evening, as they passed through a gulch with towering red cliffs on either side, the ground trembled. A rock slide thundered down with unnatural precision, blocking the path. Turley screamed, pulling the reins. Then arrows whistled from the cliffs above. One sliced through the air and pinned his shoulder to the wagon post. Panic erupted. One guard fell, clutching his throat, gurgling on blood. The other tried to run but tripped on his own greed, heavy gold coins spilling from his vest as he fell to a final silence. And then, from the dust and chaos, emerged the rider. He was cloaked in leather and turquoise beads, his face half covered by a red scarf. The bow in his hand still hummed with the song of vengeance. His eyes were dark, steady, and silent. He walked toward the wagon like the wind itself had bowed to let him pass. Coralie's chains clinked as she stared. The man looked at her, then knelt, producing a small satchel. He laid it at Turley's feet. The sound of silver spilling out echoed like thunder. More money than a miner could make in a decade. Enough to buy a town or a life, Turley wheezing. and pale, nodded weakly as the man spoke something in Navajo tongue. Then, with a single strike, he broke Coralie's shackles. She didn't ask who he was or why he came, because even though her body had been freed that day, she could feel it this was no rescue. It was a beginning, a storm that had been waiting, years to be unleashed, and the man who paid for her freedom wasn't just a warrior. He was the keeper of an ancient promise. The sun hung low over the desert, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the land. Coralie stumbled after the warrior in silence, each step into freedom feeling heavier than the chains she had left behind. Her feet bled, her lips cracked, but she didn't speak. Neither did he. The man who had shattered her captivity moved through the world as though the earth itself had been shaped to cradle his steps. They traveled deep into the painted wastes where the sands burned red and gold beneath the sky, and the wine carried stories the old ones, days blurred into. Nights she never asked his name. He never offered it. But she watched him in the firelight, his deliberate hands, the way he wrapped dried meat in cedar bark, the quiet grace with which he moved through brush without bending a blade of grass. He wasn't a man of idle words or comfort. He was a man forged by the same world that had tried to destroy her, but he'd survived by becoming silence itself. Coralie learned to read the sky by his glances, to move when he moved, to drink when he drank. And though the fear still clung to her like smoke, she felt something inside her shifting, an old rope loosening its grip on her ribs. On the fifth night, they reached a bluff overlooking a dry riverbed. The warrior finally paused. He sat down, his satchel still heavy with coins and secret sand, built a fire with wood he gathered silently from thorn trees. As the flames rose, he took out a small bundle wrapped in deerskin and untied it. Inside was a necklace, an obsidian stone carved, with a spiral sun and bound with sinew and turquoise beads. He held it out to her with both hands, as if offering more than just ornament. Coralie hesitated, then took it. The moment it touched her skin, she felt a chill, like standing at the threshold of a story she wasn't ready to hear. The warrior finally spoke that night. His voice was low, worn like the edge of a river stone. He told her only one thing, that the necklace once belonged to his sister, a girl who had been taken by white traders and never seen again. The coins he carried weren't from gold rushes or poker tables. They were the inheritance of a father who had buried 3 sons and wept over a 4th child who vanished into a world that paid for women in chains. Coralie realized then that she hadn't been freed at random. She had been chosen. And the price he paid was not for her body but for something far older. Something that the desert had whispered to him in his sleep. By dawn, they moved again, this time northward toward the canyons of Tuig, where people still remembered the old names of rivers and birds. But the land was restless. The scars of war and railroad greed still ran fresh across the hills. White prospectors had begun carving tunnels into sacred lands, and Union deserters turned bandits roamed the territories like wolves with rifles. Word spread fast. A Navajo man seen traveling with a fugitive white woman. Posters appeared, rewards promised. Coralie's face, sketched in charcoal, was pinned to wooden posts in border towns, her eyes always wrong in the drawings, her lips always twisted in guilt. In one mining town, they passed silently through at dusk. She wore a dusty shawl and walked 3 paces behind him. No one looked twice until a boy in a brimmed cap shouted, "Ain't that the chain girl?" Within minutes, riders gave chase. The warrior didn't run. He led her through goat trails, over rocky spines, and across streams that erased their scent. His horse untouched and hidden until that moment carried them swift and sure through the narrow passes. But in a place called Red Hollow, they found themselves surrounded. 5 men on horseback, one with a shotgun, all dressed in the ragged uniforms of the Confederate past mercenaries turned bounty hunters. Their faces held the same hunger she had seen in Turley, the kind that turned justice into business. The warrior stood still, his hands at his sides. The leader dismounted, walked forward, and pointed at Coralie. "She's got a price on her head. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Redskin." The desert paused. The hawk circled. Even the wind drew breath. The warrior didn't blink. And then, without a word, he dropped a leather pouch onto the dirt. The leader opened it. Silver. Again. A bribe. But not just that. Inside was a military medal, Union, bloodstained. Real. The leader stared. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked at the others. Where'd you get this? He finally muttered. The warrior said nothing. The bounty men backed away without a fight. Coralie never learned what that medal meant or whose blood had darkened its ribbon. But it was the second time she had seen the power of a past that refused to stay buried. They kept riding. The hills turned green. Trees rose like sentinels around them. And when they reached the edge of a valley carved like a cradle into the earth, the warrior finally said one word, home. But as Coralie dismounted, something sharp twisted inside her. She had escaped the flames, the chains, the hunters. Yet she knew, deep down, her redemption wasn't finished, because whatever that valley held, it would ask something from her. In return, and the necklace against her skin had begun to burn. They descended into the valley just as the first snowfall kissed the tops of the cottonwoods. It wasn't winter yet, but the air held that quiet warning, the kind that made birds fly lower and fire smoke sweeter. The valley was unlike anything Coralie had known. It whispered, it watched. Every hill and hollow felt stitched with memory, as though the land itself had a pulse. The warrior walked ahead without explanation. He didn't need to speak. Here, his footsteps knew the way. They crossed a stream so clear it mirrored the sky. Past a hollowed stump filled with old offering twigs tied with blue thread, stones stacked in spirals, feathers arranged with ceremony. Coralie's boots sank into wet moss, her eyes drifting from the black cliffs above to the tiny cave openings that dotted them like watching eyes. The place was sacred. She could feel it in her chest like the beat of a forgotten drum. At the valley's center sat a small dwelling, built from stone and cedar, half hidden beneath an overhang. It looked too modest to hold anything of value, but the warrior entered it with reverence, as if unlocking a temple. Coralie followed, her breath clouding in the cold air. Inside, the walls were lined with jars of dried corn and bundles of herbs. A carved wooden trunk sat near the fire pit. He knelt beside it and opened it with a key made from bone. Coralie watched, unsure whether she should turn away, but her eyes were pulled forward. Inside were three things: a faded photograph, a small pouch of turquoise stones, and a leather-bound journal. The warrior took the journal, held it close, and then passed it to her. It was written into hands, his and a woman's. Coralie began to read. It started years before, long before her trial, her chains, her suffering. It told of a young girl taken from their tribe by a trader and sold into servitude in the East. A sister whose trail went cold in a city called St. Joseph. The words wrapped around her like a rising tide, because the girl they spoke of was named Atsa, and she had died in a fire. The journal ended there, but Coralie's breath caught. The dates matched, the place matched, the girl's story was hers. Hers was the girl's. Coralie staggered back. The warrior didn't move. His gaze held hers with quiet certainty. He had known. Not from her mouth, but from the burn scar behind her. The scar his mother had described when she cried out for the lost daughter every night until her voice gave out. The necklace, the whispers in the flames, everything had led to this. Coralie wasn't just a random girl dragged through injustice. She was blood, kin, Atsa reborn, and somehow she had returned. The truth cleaved through her like a blade. Everything. She had lost her name, her past. Her future had circled back in this hidden place. She ran outside. The snow had started to fall harder now, covering the ground in a thin, ghostly layer. She looked up at the cliffs, the sky, the ridges she'd crossed. The weight of belonging was too heavy, too foreign. She had never asked for this. Had never imagined her scars carried someone else's story inside them. But the valley didn't ask permission. That night, as firelight danced across stone walls, the warrior whose name she finally learned was Tobalit cedar bark and traced symbols in the ash. He didn't need to explain them. The story was now hers too. He told her that the land accepted her, that the spirits remembered her, that her chains had never belonged to her in the first place. They had belonged to the history that tried to erase her. But even peace had its price. 3 days later, the sound of hooves returned. Not one rider, not 5, a dozen. And they were not prospectors or bounty hunters. They wore navy blue coats, shiny brass buttons, and the confidence of soldiers. Union men sent from Fort Clayton. They carried warrants, not just for Coralie, but for Toba. The gold he had paid for her ransom traced. The metal he had used to turn away mercenaries belonged to a colonel who had gone missing years ago in a skirmish near the Rio Grande. They surrounded the valley like wolves circling a weakened deer. The officer dismounted and shouted toward the home. Coralie and Toba stood in the doorway, firelight casting their silhouettes into the snow. There was no escape this time. The valley had become a trap, but Coralie wasn't the girl who trembled behind bars anymore. She looked at the man who had saved her not once, but again and again, and saw the truth. Toba had never been trying to hide. He had been trying to return something sacred. Her and now it was her turn. She stepped forward unarmed unyielding as the guns raised and the snow deepened. She knew whatever happened next wouldn't just change her life. It would write the next chapter in a story the world had tried to forget. The story of chains broken not by luck, but by legacy. The sky over the valley turned silver with snowfall, each flake falling like a whispered warning from the heavens. Coralie stood firm, her bare hands visible, her voice steady though her heart thundered inside her chest like war drums. Around her, Union rifles clicked into readiness, men barking orders, boots crunching over sacred earth. The officer at the front, Lieutenant Marshal Greeley, was young, starched, and full of the kind of arrogance that grew in barracks, not battlefields. He barked her name as if it were poison, demanding she surrender for transport back to St. Joseph for retrial, claiming new evidence had come to light. But she didn't move. Behind her, Toba stood silent, the weight of the valley pressing down on his shoulders. He hadn't reached for his bow, hadn't touched a weapon. He understood the balance too well. Violence here would not just stain the snow, it would desecrate the very land they stood upon. But the soldiers didn't understand such things. They read the law in lines of ink and loops of wire, not in stars and cedar ash. Greeley advanced. A pair of men followed, each holding iron cuffs. Coralie's eyes flicked to Toba, his face a statue carved by wind and sorrow. Then she stepped forward, but not in surrender. She reached into her coat and pulled out the journal, the same one that told the story of Atsa, of the fire, of the child taken and lost. She didn't speak. She handed it to the nearest soldier with eyes softer than the rest. He looked confused, thumbing through the pages until he reached the photograph inside. Then he paled. The journal passed from hand to hand like a flame, and when Greeley read it, his smirk cracked. There, in the curled ink, was a confession from a dying trader who had trafficked stolen children. He had written of a girl with a scar behind her ear, sold to a baker in Missouri. He thought the baker had married her, but she had simply been raised under his roof. The man who had written the letter had died alone, but his guilt had been sealed in words. Greeley tried to brush it off as hearsay, but the names matched. So did the timeline. Even the scar behind Coralie's ear was referenced. The officer's hands trembled slightly, though his voice stayed sharp, but the men under his command had begun to murmur. One of them, a sergeant with years in his beard and doubts in his eyes, stepped forward and said the words that changed everything. She was sold. She was stolen. You're pointing rifles at a girl who never should have been in chains. Silence fell over the men like a verdict. The balance had shifted. Greeley swore under his breath, but he saw the truth in their eyes. To arrest Coralie now would be to stage a kidnapping in uniform. He ordered them to stand down, but the damage had already been done. His voice no longer carried. One by one, the men lowered their weapons. Coralie exhaled for the first time in hours, but even as the soldiers backed away, the tension remained. Because there was still the matter of Toba, his bounty, his supposed theft. The metal, Greeley, desperate for some threat of control, accused him of murder. Said the metal he'd used to bribe mercenaries had been listed in a stolen military report. Toba said nothing. Instead, he reached into the leather pouch he always carried and pulled out a folded document sealed with wax. He handed it to the sergeant, who broke the seal and read. His eyes widened. The document wasn't forged. It was a legal deed. A commission. Toba was not just a warrior. He was a decorated scout, a government-contracted Navajo trapper who had served alongside the very colonel whose medal he carried. The colonel had died in an ambush, and before his final breath, he had handed the medal and deed to Toba, naming him heir to his estate and inheritance. Toba had never claimed because wealth was not his aim. But now that document spoke louder than any accusation. The truth settled into the snowfall like justice finally found. Greeley lowered his eyes. His command had unraveled. The soldiers mounted their horses and rode back down the trail, quiet, subdued, and changed. When they were gone, Coralie collapsed to her knees, the snow numbing her skin, her breath shaky but free. Toba approached, placing the obsidian necklace in her palm. It no longer burned. It pulsed like a heartbeat. She looked up at him, and for the first time, something passed between them that was not silence or pain or fear. It was belonging. Later that night, they built a fire not for warmth but for ceremony. Coralie took the chain cuffs that once bound her and placed them into the flames. They hissed and blackened, but they did not scream. They were only metal. She was something more. The valley slept beneath a blanket of stars, but it would remember, because redemption had come not from escape, but from truth, finally spoken in a land that never forgot its daughters. The snow melted quickly as spring warmed the valley, but Coralie did not leave. She could have taken the legal documents, the journal, even a share of Toba's hidden inheritance, and disappeared into a world that had once branded her criminal. But something bound her here stronger than any shackle ever had, not obligation, but resonance. This place knew her now, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen without being judged, known without being punished. She learned the rhythms of the land, rose before dawn to feed the horses and gather roots, cleaned the shrine stones on the hillside, careful to leave tobacco offerings when passing sacred cedar groves. Toba taught her without words, through gesture, through patience, through silence that carried more weight than sermons. She had never felt so anchored, so whole. She was no longer Coralie the accused, nor was she just Atsa reborn. She was something new, formed at the fracture point between two lives. But the world outside the valley had not forgotten, and redemption, in a land so soaked in greed and conquest, often stirs resentment. Weeks after the soldiers left, word reached a trading post just beyond the mountain range. A white woman living alone with a Navajo man in land believed to be rich with minerals. It was enough to set fire to old hostilities. Prospectors whispered, politicians stirred. And soon, a man from Coralie's past caught wind. Edgar Winthrop. He had once courted her when she was still baking biscuits at dawn and selling them by the schoolhouse. He had also testified against her in court, claiming she'd made threats to burn her father's shop, painting her with lies crafted in jealousy and entitlement. After the trial, he'd vanished west to chase silver dreams. Now he returned with a posse of 6 men and the deed to a mining claim that overlapped the valley edge. They arrived at dusk, their rifles gleaming and smiles full of rot. Coralie and Toba watched from the ridge as the men set up camp and began hammering stakes into the earth, disturbing old burial mounds they couldn't even see. Coralie felt her breath leave her in waves. It wasn't fear, it was fury. Toba said nothing. He lit a bundle of sage and let the smoke spiral upward. They both knew what had to be done. They didn't fight with bullets. They fought with evidence. Coralie rode down the mountain 2 days later, dressed not as a fugitive, but as a woman with a name that mattered again. She carried with her the official deed, the colonel's signature, and the journal pages that traced her lineage back to a stolen child. She found a circuit judge in Santa Fe, an old man with sharp eyes and a forgotten debt to Toba's father, who had once saved his life during a snowstorm in '59. The judge examined every paper, every scar, every word, and then he sealed the case with a stamp. The valley was protected, designated as ancestral land. No mining claim could touch it. When Coralie returned, the sun was just cresting the eastern rim, washing the hills in pale gold. She found Winthrop and his men tearing into a stream with picks and dynamite. Too proud to stop, she didn't scream. She didn't plead. She handed the judge's order to their leader and waited. He read it. And when he tried to tear it, a rifle bolt snapped behind him. Toba, standing on the ridge, no longer silent. The men left before dusk, grumbling curses swallowed by the wind. But Winthrop lingered. He approached Coralie alone, something ugly flickering behind his eyes. You think this is justice? He hissed. She didn't flinch. I think you finally got to see who I really am. He laughed bitterly. You're still just a girl with ashes in her past. She stepped closer. And you're still a man who thought power came from pointing fingers. Then she turned and walked away. That night, thunder cracked over the valley. Even though the sky remained clear, some said it was the spirits welcoming her back. Others said it was just the mountains settling. But Coralie knew it was the sound of something ancient breaking free. Chains, perhaps, or the silence that had hung over the land for too long. Toba stood beside her, not as her savior, but as her equal, to souls marked by scars and memory. Finally standing on land that remembered both their names. But the story was not done. Because peace is not a destination, it's a threshold. And as spring turned to summer, something stirred in the hills beyond, something that would test everything. They had rebuilt. Summer came with warm winds and high grass swaying like waves in the belly of the valley. Coralie moved through the days with a steadiness she never knew she had. She tended the earth. She taught herself to stitch seed bags from hide and painted clay pots with symbols that spoke of fire and rebirth. What she could not forget, she no longer ran from. The valley had accepted her story, not despite the ash in it, but because of it. Toba had begun restoring the old path that led from the sacred spring to the cliff altar. He said the spirits needed their voice back. Each stone he moved, each carving he traced into the canyon wall, felt like an offering, one not just to ancestors, but to the ones yet to come. Coralie often watched him from a distance, not interrupting, knowing some healing must happen in silence. But peace was never something the frontier gave freely. Late one night, a fire lit the eastern rim. Not lightning, not stars, torches, a new group of intruders had arrived. Rough, ragged men driven not by law, but lust for land. Hired by a land speculator who refused to recognize the valley's new legal protections. They were here to push Toba and Coralie out quietly, violently, and permanently. Coralie saw them before they struck. From the lookout stone near the cedar grove, she counted 6 riders and 2 men on foot. They had dogs, ropes, and rifles. She ran back, breath pounding, and found Toba already preparing. He didn't look surprised. He rarely did. They didn't have time to run. And they refused to hide. Instead, they prepared the valley. They unrolled the prayer blankets at the shrine, tied strands of juniper across entry paths, and placed old river stones in the way of every wagon trail, not to block, but to mark. The intruders came before dawn, crossing the boundary stones like they meant nothing. They fired shots into the sky, yelling slurs, promising no court would care if a half-breed and his pet girl vanished into the dirt. But they were wrong. This time, the land was not silent. Coralie stood in their path, dressed in a robe stitched from white elk hide, her face marked in red clay. She held no weapon. She held history. She told them to leave. They laughed. And then the sound came, a low rumble at first, like thunder caught in the earth's throat. Then, horses. Dozens. Riders emerged from the northern trail. Navajo, Apache, Pueblo. Men and women, young and old, summoned not by telegram or letter, but by the way the wind spoke through the mountains. Word had spread. Toba's name still meant something, and Coralie's return axe's legacy had been felt in dreams and fire dances. The intruders dropped their rifles. One of them tried to shoot, But a warning arrow landed inches from his hand before he could pull the trigger. No one had to die that morning. But the message was clear. The valley was protected not just by papers or past titles, but by the blood and bone of people who refused to forget where they came from. The intruders left, quiet, shaken, never to return. When the sun rose fully, Coralie walked to the cliff altar with Toba at her side. There in the stone, he carved a final symbol, a spiral with a broken chain at its center. She placed her hand on it, and for the first time, she felt something leave her. The last of the fear, not the memory. That would stay, but the fear. And in its place grew a fire made not of anger, but of truth. Years passed. The valley became a refuge not for the lost, but for the returning. Coralie started a school beneath the canyon arch, teaching children whose languages had been nearly silenced how to write their own names in the old way again. Toba became a quiet elder, a man who spoke less and taught more. His fortune never counted in coins, but in stories remembered. And every spring, when the wind swept through the sagebrush, people said you could hear chains breaking not in pain, but in celebration. Because frontier redemption didn't come in the form of revenge. It came when the land opened its arms again. And a girl once buried by flame rose in the ashes of her past, not to be saved, but to return home.